Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at two other types of learning, which are cognitive learning and observational learning. So cognitive learning was originally studied by a psychologist called Edward Tolman, who found that learning could still occur without reinforcement. And this introduced the idea that there's this cognitive aspect to learning. So remember, cognition is well, we're going to look at this in a lot more detail next week, but cognition is referring to all of the mental processes involved in collecting information and storing and using that in our mind. So this is suggesting that there's this cognitive aspect to learning where we're collecting information and we're storing it and then we're using that without any need for reinforcement. And so the reason that he discovered this, the way that he discovered this was while studying rats, he found that if he put them in a maze, they were able to learn their way through it. Even without any reinforcement at the exit motivating them to get out. So what he did is he created this maze, he put the rats in there, and they would have 10 sessions in the maze without any food as reinforcement. So I know you see this here, but initially that was not there. There wasn't any reinforcement, and they were just given this time to see if they would figure out their way around the maze. And, they'd roam around, but there was no need for them to find their way out just yet. Then what he would do to test whether or not they had actually learned the maze, in other words, to test whether they had created a cognitive map, which is a mental picture of the layout of an environment. So to see if they had created a cognitive map for the maze, he then put food at the exit. And the idea was that if they were able to very quickly exit the maze, that would be an indication that they knew their way out. When it was needed, they were able to demonstrate that they had learned their way out, which is what happened. Once the food was there, they were very, very quickly able to get out of that maze and prove that they had learned the maze. So this type of learning that this demonstrates is latent learning. So learning that occurs but is not actually observable in the behavior until there is a reason to demonstrate it. So in this case, the rats had learned this cognitive map. They'd created this mental picture of the layout of the maze, but they didn't demonstrate that until there was actually a reason to demonstrate it. So until there was actually food motivating them to get out. An example would be, children, this kind of ties into observational learning, which we'll look at next, but if a child observes how their how their parents behave in the home, maybe some of those behaviors you won't see in the child just yet, but when those children themselves are adults, then maybe you would see those behaviors. So for example, if you have parents that deal with their emotions by drinking alcohol all the time, then maybe you won't see that in the child yet because they're too young to drink, don't have access to alcohol. But once they're old enough, then you start seeing that behavior reproduced. They start drinking as a way to cope with emotions. And that was something they learned from their parents. You just didn't see it until they were old enough to demonstrate it. Another example of latent learning might be when you learn the lyrics to songs. Usually you're not consciously putting effort in to try to learn it. No one is rewarding you for learning the lyrics, so there's no reinforcement or punishment there. But over time, as you're listening to that, you are cognitively learning the lyrics to that song. Your brain is collecting that information and processing it, and then you're able to sing along, you're able to reproduce it. But you might not realize that you know all the lyrics to those songs until you actually attempt to sing along and then realize that you know the lyrics. So you might not realize until there's a reason to demonstrate it. One last example of latent learning, usually when you're a kid and your parents are driving you to school, you're not actively trying to learn the directions to get to school. But if there is suddenly a day where your parents couldn't drive you and you had to walk or you had to take your bike, you would have known how to get there. You will have had this cognitive map of how to get from your house to school, and you would have learned that gradually over time, every time your parents drive you. And then eventually when you needed to demonstrate it by getting yourself there, that's when you would have seen that you had learned that. So lastly, looking at observational learning. So this is simply learning by watching others and imitating them. So this is what's happening in this picture. You've got the spider monkey watching the human drink from a bottle of water, and then it is imitating that behavior. It's modeling that behavior. Sorry, the human is modeling the behavior for the spider monkey to copy. So in this situation, the human is considered the model because it is modeling the behavior that will be imitated. This is an important type of learning because it's through observational learning that we become capable of behaviors before we even had the chance to perform them ourselves, essentially. And this is something that was studied by a psychologist called Albert Bandura, who we'll talk about a few more times throughout the semester. But he spent many years studying observational learning. And he basically, similar to Tolman, he realized that learning can occur without external reinforcement, without punishment, and he wanted to look at how that happened. And so he proposed this social learning theory. He believed that observational learning involved more than just imitation. So it's not just enough to watch and imitate. He said that observational learning also involves various internal mental states, which is what we have here. So he said that there are these four components that are involved in whether or not we actually learn through observation. So the first is attention. Are you focusing on the behavior that's being modeled? So for example, if I'm trying to teach you a dance routine, if I'm doing that for you, if I'm modeling that for you and you're not really paying attention, then you're not going to learn anything. Okay, so you first need to be making sure you're paying attention. 2 is retention. So do you remember what you observed? If I've shown you this, this dance routine, and maybe you were paying attention, but if you're not able to retain that, then you haven't learned anything. You're not going to be able to reproduce it because you haven't retained the information. The third component is reproduction, so actually being able to then perform the behavior. If you have really learned just from observing, then you should be able to reproduce it to some extent. And then the fourth component is the one that I want to focus on, is so motivation. You must actually feel motivated to copy the behavior. If you are not motivated to reproduce that behavior, then again, you're less likely to see observational learning occur. So when it comes to motivation, Bandura took this a step further and basically said that whether or not we're motivated to reproduce the behavior depends on what happens to the model. So this comes back kind of to operant conditioning and reinforcement and punishment. Basically, he's saying that whether or not we engage in the behavior depends on whether or not we see the model reinforced or punished. So vicarious reinforcement is the process where the observer sees the model rewarded, and then that makes the observer more likely to imitate the model's behavior. Okay, so it's reinforcement, but it's occurring vicariously through someone else. You are more likely to engage in the behavior because you saw someone else reinforced. And then vicarious punishment, that's the process where the observer sees the model punished, which then makes the observer less likely to imitate the model's behavior. So again, punishment that is happening to someone else, but then makes you less likely to engage in the behavior. There is a very, very famous study that he conducted, which demonstrates, the version I want to talk about, demonstrates vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment, although initially that's not what this was aimed at. So the famous experiment is Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. I'm not going to go into much detail on this, but you will need to know about it for the exam. So make sure that after this, you watch this video that will describe the original study and some of the various versions he did, because there were a lot of versions of this. But basically, he was studying the modeling of aggressive and violent behaviors. This was around the time that TVs were starting to be put into people's houses. And, you had children at home watching TV. And that raised the question, are kids going to be copying violent behaviors? What effect does this have? And so the children would observe adults acting aggressively towards this 5-foot Bobo doll. So the parents, the adults would, hit it and whack it and push it and act aggressively towards it. And then Bandura was interested in what would the children then do. And they would, of course, copy the behavior. They would act aggressively. The version of the study that they don't talk about in this video that you're going to watch, that I want to highlight, is the version that did look at vicarious punishment and reinforcement. What he did is he'd have the children watch the adults act aggressively towards the Bobo doll. But after they finished acting aggressively, one of 3 things would happen. In one group, the adults were praised for their behavior. In another group, they were punished for the behavior, and in the third group they were simply ignored for their behavior. So what he then wanted to look at was, will the children's behavior be influenced by what happened to the adults, whether they were praised, punished, or ignored. And he found that it did influence how they behaved. If the child had seen the adult punished, they were less likely to act aggressively towards the doll. But if they had seen the adult either praised or completely ignored, then they were more likely to imitate the adult. So that's demonstrating vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. So ultimately, Bandura concluded that children do watch and learn from the adults around them. And of course, that can have both pro-social and anti-social consequences. It's a problem when kids start acting aggressively, but it also means that kids are watching and learning from pro-social positive behaviors as well. So like I said, please make sure that after this you watch this video, which will explain the study in a bit more detail.